Neil Armstrong fue el responsable de capitanear un sueño histórico: alcanzar la Luna. La fuerza de las imágenes inspiradas en las ilusiones del romance y la aventura. Todo lo que la Luna ha representado para la inventiva del hombre estaba al alcance del ser humano. La tecnología espacial daba el paso para transitar del sueño a las crónicas gloriosas. Pero eso requería de un líder. Alguien con la instrucción y el temple para cincelar su nombre entre los que marcan una diferencia de vida. Neil Armstrong inició su carrera como piloto a los 15 años, cuando empezó a tomar lecciones de vuelo, y como una definición de su capacidad y determinación, recibió la licencia de piloto antes de graduarse de la secundaria. En 1950 participó en la Guerra de Corea, donde voló en 78 misiones de combate. Durante 17 años trabajó como ingeniero, piloto de pruebas, astronauta y administrador del Comité Consultivo Nacional, NACA, y la que sería su agencia sucesora, la Administración Nacional para la Aeronáutica y el Espacio, la NASA. Su vida y la de la carrera espacial se transformó por entero el 20 de julio de 1969, cuando comandó la misión lunar de la nave espacial Apolo 11. Es un pequeño paso para el hombre, pero un gran salto para la humanidad. Es la frase que marcó su destino en la historia. Su sapiencia se alejó de los reflectores para pasar a la enseñanza y la transmisión de conocimientos entre estudiantes y audiencias selectas, receptivas y capaces de dimensionar el impacto de su instrucción. Damas y caballeros, Neil Armstrong.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be with you here, and I thank you for the wonderful welcome, and I thank GNP for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this gathering here in Mexico's capital city. You might ask me, how does it feel to be the oldest person in the room? Well, I'm not thrilled about it, but I am encouraged by some old-timers who did great things as senior citizens. Galileo's greatest discovery came at age 73. Edison was still inventing at age 80. Toscanini was still conducting at age 87. And Titian painted his great Battle of Lepanto at age 95. So, if there is a need for someone to command a mission to Mars, I'm available. And if there is anyone here tonight senior to me, I apologize and I congratulate you. I recognize while some of you are in property, casualty, and liability areas, I would guess that all of you are quite familiar and knowledgeable about life insurance. So in preparing for this meeting with all of you this evening, I looked up the early 17th century paper by John Grant, a clothing store owner in London, England, entitled "The Natural and Political Observations Made Upon the Bills of Mortality." Observations was perhaps not the first, but was probably the most important early treatise on vital statistics. Grant compiled data on the cause of death of Londoners as collected weekly by parish clerks. And it was a blockbuster, going through at least 5 editions. The data was immensely helpful, but it did not include the age of the decedents. And those of you who are familiar with this kind of history will know that the big breakthrough came 3 decades later when another London gentleman analyzed the birth and death records in the city of Breslau in Silesia. Those records did include ages and provided the basis for his construction of the first mortality table. That table removed much of the uncertainty about the lifespan of citizenry. His report provided the basis for actuarial science, annuities, and life insurance, and initiated the application of a mathematical rigor to what in time became your gigantic industry. I have that paper in my library at home, as I suppose perhaps some of you do. I commend it to you. It can be found in the philosophical translations of the Royal Society of 1693. Some of you may remember the fellow that did those studies and built that first mortality table. He was not a life underwriter, an actuary, an insurance man, or even a mathematician. He was, in fact, an astronomer, Edmund Halley. He was a man of many interests, among which he believed that comets were not itinerant vagabonds, as generally believed, but were cyclical, returning from time to time like a cousin in need of cash. Halley studied what facts were available from the records, deduced that several comets that had been observed over the past 3 centuries might just be the same one. He predicted that it would appear again in 1759. And when it actually reappeared as he predicted, it was named after him, Halley's Comet. Unfortunately, he had died 17 years earlier and never had the opportunity to see his comet. Among his many achievements, Edmund Halley was appointed the Astronomer Royal of Britain. The 1910 Halley's Comet was awesome. It stretched from horizon 2/3 of the way up to the zenith in the sky. The next, much heralded return of Halley's Comet in 1986, as many of you will remember, was less impressive. Halley is expected to return again in 2061, and I expect to miss the show, unless we have some unforeseen developments in genetic engineering or cryohibernation. But some of you will live to see it, and you can tell your grandchildren about your insurance connection and Halley's Comet. I had the great pleasure of enjoying the friendship of Peter Scott, an Englishman who was an exceptional biologist, aviator, artist, and oceanographer. He died 20 years ago. His father, Robert Scott, was the British naval aviator, the British naval officer, and an Antarctic explorer. He was the first to climb the high Antarctic plateau, but he had an even greater goal. He wanted to be the first human to reach the South Pole. In 1910, when my friend Peter was 1 year old, his father's exploration party reached Ross Island and set up base camp. They started over the ice in motor-driven sledges and used ponies to climb the steep slopes of that 3,500-meter Antarctic plateau. The temperatures were 40 to 70 degrees below zero. They battled blizzards in fiercely miserable conditions, slogging through the snow and ice month after month. Finally, on 18 January 1912, they reached their goal, the South Pole. And what did they find? A tent with a Norwegian flag on it. Roald Amundsen had arrived there a month earlier. Disappointed, they began their 1,300-kilometer trek back to their base camp. Scott and his party almost made it back to the safe northern shore of Antarctica, but not quite. Their expedition perished on the ice. Scott left letters, in one of which he wrote, and I'll quote, "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last." My friend Peter Scott never knew his father. So I decided I'd spend our brief time this evening talking about goals and risks. Goals and risks are part of all our lives. There's little progress toward goals without a modicum of risk. In the insurance world, that mortality table removed much of the risk of insuring lives, but not all. Unexpected changes in lifestyle patterns could introduce unexpected risks, as could many other unforeseen developments. One unforeseen development occurred because of an international scientific program a half century ago. The program was called the International Geophysical Year, or IGY. 66 countries joined together to analyze our Earth: oceanography, meteorology, solar activity, the Earth's magnetosphere, the upper atmosphere, cosmic rays, meteors, all very mysterious stuff to most of us. The IGY began in the summer of 1957. That particular time was selected because it was the time of maximum sunspot activity. And all sorts of phenomena, weather, radio reception, abnormalities in the Earth's magnetic field, seemed somehow to be related to sunspots. That time was the peak of the Cold War, the war between East and West, and both sides were amassing hordes of long-range rockets with nuclear warheads to threaten destruction of their opponents with these instruments of mass destruction. Russian and American scientists recognized that if it would be possible to use such a rocket to put a man-made object up into orbit around the Earth, carrying scientific instruments, it would have a perspective that would allow accurate measurements, perhaps solving many of the Earth's mysteries. They didn't recognize it at the time, but they had started a new competition, which would become known as the space race. And the Soviets won the gold and the silver with the first Earth-orbiting satellites, Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2, whilst the Americans' first try fizzled, which gave the journalists a lot of fun. They called it Kaputnik. But the Yanks finally won a bronze with Explorer 1. Both the Soviets and the Americans had another goal. They were obsessed with getting a man into space. Neither was certain what kind of person could be persuaded to take the trip. Prisoners were suggested. Soldiers could be ordered. Physicians were possibilities. Finally, both sides used pilots. They were accustomed to being closed up in small spaces and actually seemed to enjoy being away from the surface of the Earth. Both nations used their biggest rockets, originally built for intercontinental ballistic missiles, to try to fire a man into space first. Again, the Russians won the gold with Yuri Gagarin, the silver with German Titov, and the Americans settled again for a bronze with John Glenn. America really got into the space race with the Gemini spacecraft, a two-man machine, the first with onboard navigation and guidance. Earlier spacecraft crews, both Soviet and American, navigated by looking out the window. Hey, that must be Australia. The Gemini was the first manned spacecraft to carry a computer into space. It didn't have 4 gigabytes. It didn't have 4 megabytes. It had 4K, 4,096 words of memory, and was very slow. Much less powerful than the computer in your mobile phone. But it allowed us to do things that we had thought impossible. Changing orbits, rendezvousing with another spacecraft, and returning to Earth to a predetermined landing point. We thought it was remarkable. But the principal goal, the goal that trumped all others, was putting humans on the moon. And it seemed very, very difficult. Perhaps impossible. And how do you tackle an almost impossible task? Both the Soviet Union, covertly, and the Americans, openly, were asking themselves that very question. Some very big rockets were required, far bigger than any that had ever been built. A method for navigating through space had to be developed. Enormous facilities for assembling the rockets and launching them had to be designed and constructed. 1,000 technical details needed attention. Was it really possible?
Recuerda suscribirte a nuestro canal para que no te pierdas ninguno de nuestros videos. No olvides comentar, darle like, activar la campanita de notificaciones y compartir en todas tus redes sociales.